Yeah, this recording is
Okay.
started. You may go.
Great. Thank you, Vishal. And also, Vishal, let me know how much time we have today. Then I can tailor my presentation. I can go for 30 minutes, and then we can have lots of discussion, however you want me to do it.
Yeah, I would love to divide the time in half, your half time your presentation and half discussion today. So you can
Sure.
take between 30 to 40 minutes. That would be all
30
right.
to 40 minutes. Okay, I'll keep it brief then because I know this isn't typically when we do a PhD level seminar, in my days anyway, with Derrida and the philosophers, we planned for 3 hours, but with him, he would go on 5, 6 hours. And even with what are called directed readings in the philosophy department with a single faculty member, if we plan for 3 hours, you can go for 5, 6 hours. So we'll keep it very brief. First of all, I want to thank Vishal for reaching out, and I'm so honored. I wish I was there with you. Vishal did ask me to give you a little bit about my background, and we spoke about different types of topics. And I'm hoping, if you're satisfied, we can continue. It's a bit soft. Okay, let me see here. Maybe if I turn one thing off here. Maybe if I speak closely into the microphone. Is this clear? Better for everybody? Is it? Does this sound better?
Yeah,
Yes.
that's much
Okay.
better.
Great. Thank you, Risha. Okay. As I mentioned, I wish I was there with you in person. Next time, I hope with a chance to come to India. I've never been to New Delhi, so I should feel a bit embarrassed that I can admit that. How can you come to India and not come to Delhi, where you all are? My family immigrated to the United States from Chennai, Tamil Nadu, and both my parents are Tamilian. A long time ago, decades before you were born. And so I consider myself second generation because I came here when I was 3 months old. And so my own experience with Eastern traditions, other than my own personal upbringing raised as a Hindu, and the surrounding Indian communities, which were predominantly Hindu, some Muslim, some Christian, but as you know, majority Hindu, it was very limited until a much later stage in life when I had an opportunity as a visiting professor to come to the University of Madras and then 2012 at the Tata Institute. And so I'm looking forward to rediscovering my own heritage and engaging in the comparative dialogues of Western philosophy with, I think, a tremendous promise that's coming from you all. And meeting so many Indian students, PhD students, postdocs, doing philosophy. And one of the things Vishal and I talked about is why do we even do this? Why did I come to it? And my first response is that it's if I'm going to be a genuine, um, I don't want to say teacher, but someone who is a student of philosophy, even to this age, and you're just getting started, it's almost an impossible question to answer. It takes a great deal of risk and sacrifice, and all the great philosophers have attested to that. We're not religious monks, rishis, or sadhus. We're not sitting in the temples as priests. Um, but every great philosopher in the West has committed their lives and staked their lives as an attestation to the question that you posed, Vishal, without being able to answer it. It's a risk that even Derrida once talked about. And he even mentioned that, for example, in the Western tradition, if you look at the pre-Socratic Greeks and the great Greeks, Plato, Aristotle, it's before the birth of Christianity. So they were pagan, Hellenistic. And then, of course, the Judaic background is earlier, and then Rabbinic Judaism doesn't emerge till the first century AD. But, pre-Christian, and then, of course, Christianity takes over the West, and then there's the Christian foundations of scholastic metaphysics, Middle Ages, Aquinas. But by the time you get to Descartes, Leibniz, Spinoza in the 1600s, Hume in the 1700s, of course, Kant and the German idealists, up to Hegel, there is a radical break from religion, meaning their own upbringing. So whether the exceptional individuals like Spinoza, who was Jewish, but also pushed his own faith to the limits, to the point where he was excommunicated from his own community. And as you can imagine, being very difficult to be a philosopher in the 1600s, 1700s, questioning Christianity without a certain amount of risk. So there is an upbringing of some kind, but then there's a break. But the break leaves you in suspension. And in that suspension, you're tormented. But you're not tormented because of the skeptical questions you pose to your own religious background and the answers it's supposed to provide. It's about a testament to your responsibility for yourselves and your communities. What does such a break mean? But out of the break, there is then a possibility for thinking to start. So I would just foreground that. I put all that there because it's just a good way to understand why do we have this conviction and commitment. On a personal note, and maybe you can relate because we all share the same cultural background. I'm of Indian ancestry, and you're Indian, growing up in India. I'll speak for myself, but the immigrants who came of many generations, the pressure is to go into medicine, like my dad, science, like my brother, engineering, medicine, engineering. These days, business, maybe law, but philosophy, what is that? And my first reaction has always been, let me see here. Who has the oldest philosophical tradition in the world? If you want to go to the Vedas, you tell me how old they are, the Upanishads, and then, of course, the epics. But who has the oldest? Oh, so this incredible culture, and I'm not saying that out of pride because I come from Indian ancestry. I'm saying it because of you. I was raised here in the West, and I have to be honest. On the one hand, I'm very critical of the West because you can see the kind of world that the West has created, especially now with Trump. But it's been going on since my whole lifetime, this American imperialism. So I've never been happy here. That's going to sound strange. And every time I go to the global South and the East, my heart is alive. But of course, I don't know the customs, the norms, the languages, the traditions. So it's a real dilemma. And not to make the connection to Derrida very strongly, but if you look at his background, Sephardic, Jewish, Algerian, so closer to our color than the white Europeans. Vichy France with the Nazis and the colonization, but the suppression of the Jews, the Islamic Arabic majority. I mentioned the race dimension because he's not some light-skinned European. So to be conflated with the Islamic structure, which, as you know, was colonized, the Islamophobia, the anti-Arab racism that Frantz Fanon talks about, the Nazi oppression of the Jews. And then he goes to France as a 19-year-old, not much younger than you guys, older than you guys, and to face the European racism. So this confounding influence, in a way, is his not only critique of the unified nature of identity and subjectivity, but his idea of difference is an internal differentiation that's never fully present. And any attempt to understand what that is, the being of that or the presence of it, to critique metaphysics like he did in his own way, has to delay or postpone. What he means by that is not just postponing like, oh, I'm supposed to do this right now. I'm late. I don't want to do it. I have to finish my paper, my exam. I'm postponing it. I know I should work on it. He doesn't mean that type of delay. He just means the internal sense of an arrival that's never on time, and also the inability to decide on what a meaningful substance or presence is. So it's very much at the heart of time, and how we even enter into this question of time. Most people, take it beyond that and apply it to something more readily accessible, like difference is more important than identity. Writing is more, has been suppressed by speech, but writing is a threat to the canon or structure of meaning, of text, of canon. There's no simple way to represent things. So that's how they usually think of deconstruction. I think it's much deeper as a philosopher, and you're all philosophers. So the way I'd like to enter into this question, now that I've given my background, that one is not necessarily, you can say I'm of global South ancestry, Indian ancestry, but I was made in the West. these are simple dichotomies that I think we can try to suspend. And the reason why I posed this subject, which I think can relate to other subjects in the future, of this thing called the West, which, by the way, Derrida, I told you his background, the outer fringes of the Western canon, Judeo-Christian canon of the West, the pre-Socratic Greeks, Christian medieval structure, the German idealists, and then the 20th century. You're familiar with many figures in the 20th century, Derrida in the 60s. This West is the theme for the talk is to ask some basic questions that the great philosophers themselves asked. They were obsessed with this question of being. And I apologize, you'll say, how come I don't know Hindi or Sanskrit? Because I grew up in a Tamil household in the US, which is also my Tamil. I can't even really speak, but I can understand a little bit. So I never heard Hindi. And then, of course, growing up in the US, it's the outside language, English, Spanish in California. So, but I'd like to know from those of you that can take me into the Hindi and the Sanskrit, maybe the relationship between the two. But this question of being for the pre-Socratics, certainly for Parmenides, and definitely by the time you get to Plato and Aristotle in the different types of metaphysical systems. And maybe I can turn this up here. So to try to open up the question of being, and for a moment, as Heidegger says, let's not think of being in terms of the verb to be. It's used to describe what exists. If you get into the Greek words like physis, nature, aletheia, unconcealing, revealing, anergeia and dynamos, kinesis, movement and activity, some kind of event structure, if you want to think about when they think about being, but they were compelled to think about it. And then secondarily, they either assume that time is divided between being and becoming. So being doesn't change, it's eternal, some kind of substance. Becoming is what we normally spatialize as change. Change of motion. Motion is a change of space, or internal change, metabole, inside the structure, but change. So a very complex relationship between change and movement. They were perplexed by this. And if you try to think of the ousia, the being of these, you get into all kinds of paradoxes. The being of becoming, the becoming of being. Or as Aristotle says in the Physics, Book 4, what is time? Does it even exist? Is it among the things that exist? Okay, well, some people say it does, but we can barely understand it. Change, you kind of understand what that is. Physicists can tell us what motion is, the moving object in space. Time, which counts as in numbers of movement through clocks, for example. But that's not time. So time has always been this mystery, but the obsession has been with being. And I tell this story because if one assumes that time exists or doesn't exist, typically it's only three. Everything is three in the West: past, present, future. The now, the no longer now, past, cease to exist. Future now, yet to exist. Two things that don't exist, part of something that exists. That's Aristotle's problem in the physics. And it's really not till the great moment with Kant in the Critique of Pure Reason, in the Schematism, when he's trying to understand, after Hume's great critique of causality, there's never the rules of reason can't furnish any intuition that can prove the causal relationship between two things. It's a matter of habit and repetition and our experiences. So Kant's struggling with this, but he has to find something that allows the concepts that we have to generate the representations that are consistent about a manifold that we receive through our senses, by which experience provides. But that processing is irreducible to anything empirical. He wants to find out what that mysterious thing is, that thing buried in us. And that turns out to be some very nebulous definition of time called in the schematism. It's time that forms this schematic linkage, the third thing that allows our concepts to relate to objects, and that's how we can know stuff. We'll never get to the thing itself. But then he leaves this question of time unquestioned. His very simple definition, I say simple because it's the substrate, it's the thing that doesn't change in order for change to take place in it. I lay all this out, and Hegel, of course, is going to come and try to do something with this in his work, saying, no, there has to be a relationship or a synthesis of both the absolute notion of mind being conscious of itself and the mystery of time. And he goes back to Kant, but that's shrouded in a mystery. It takes Heidegger's being in time, long story short. Kierkegaard comes in about the temporal and the eternal, the finite and the infinite. Nietzsche's critique of everything and the eternal. It takes Heidegger in 1927. And that's where I will hopefully be at the midway of my talk, but I want to just today, all I can really accomplish is make a few remarks as to the significance of Heidegger's being in time with regard to this whole Western tradition. And then make this kind of deconstruction of even Heidegger in the West. Like, what happened here in the West? And what does that mean for us? What does it mean for young philosophers like yourself? So if it's okay, Vishal, I'd like to just share my text, The Being in Time, which you've all probably seen. And when we get to our Q&A, how come we can't see this? Being in Time. Okay, now you can probably see it, right? Can everybody see the table of contents?
Yeah, it is visible, sir.
Great. So 1962, the English translation. There was another English translation in the 1990s. There's a guy from Canada who just came out last year. He's been working on it for 30 years. So you can look at his translation if you want, but it's still so new. But for us, this is the standard 1962 English translation. And you can see, from those pre-Socratics, Heraclitus is difficult to understand because his main idea is becoming, and change. But Parmenides, Plato, Aristotle, the whole Western metaphysical tradition, being. And here's Heidegger coming along again, but at least to his credit, he says being and time. So it's not just ontology or the question of being and coming up with an answer. The whole work is about, well, we have this tradition and it's posed this question, but has anyone asked about the meaning of the question? Has anyone asked who's inquiring? Presumably us human beings, not the animal or a god. To quote Aristotle, the god or the divine must be either, the true metaphysical inquiry is either an animal or a god, but not a human being. That's metaphysics, the ontotheological construction of metaphysics. But here Heidegger's not necessarily bringing it back to the human being, but the inquirer. And he'll name this, as you'll see, as something called Dasein. But this question of being, it's important to keep in fact that he's interested in the meaning of the question. So that's good. That's a good step. It took 2,500 years in the West, but at least someone like him came along and asked that. So that's how he starts.
Let's suspend for a moment what we think the question of being is. It's not the verb to be. It's not being in the world. It's not entities that exist. It's not God. It's not Einsteinian space-time. It's not anything physical, material. It's not Kant's schematism or Hegel's spirit and time unity. It's not Aristotle's kind of, we look back on the Greeks and think, oh, they had innocent ideas about time. Time is not change is not motion, but they must have some relationship. It's a mystery. But here comes Heidegger. It's going to turn out that Dasein's basic being is Sorge, concern, about the entire stretch of time that it has. And as long as it's in the world, it has many possibilities to be. But its greatest possibility is going to be when it no longer is in the world, or death. But death is not dying or anything physical, like literally dying, getting hit by a car. It turns out that this possibility of no longer being is going to be Dasein's greatest possibility. And that itself is rooted in a conscience that wants to come away from the fallenness of being in the world inauthentically, just doing what people tell us to do. So Vishal, here's an answer to your question, being in time. Oh, your parents or your teachers or society, you must do this, you must do that. You don't want to. You don't want to be an engineer. You don't want to be, whatever. You want to be a philosopher. You want to do philosophy. You love it. Sophia, Sophia, loving of wisdom. So you have to come to that possibility that is the most extreme, that if you're no longer here, what will you be? And you can't come back from death, so let's leave aside religion, reincarnation for Hindu or Buddhist, and resurrection for Christian or Jewish or Muslim. There's no religion. You're finite. But that doesn't mean you're just flowing in time, linear time, like a clock. You're not just a now, minutes, hours, days just going by. So Dasein is rooted in this temporality. And if it's the one that questions being, then the horizon for this question also has to be time. And then he has one more ambition, the spatialization of time. Time is three, past, present, future. The present is now, past is no longer now. Future is yet to be now. This is derived from something what he calls more primordial and authentic. And I don't want to race ahead because it's too much for us today. But it'll turn out that this linear time that's flowing, this being of becoming of being, the pre-Socratics, the mysteries in Plato and Aristotle, anybody who's talked about time in the West, I'm just saying the West for now, Heidegger says has not only forgotten this distinction between being and beings, but we have to get to this ground. And he says this in the very beginning. The ground is just going to allow us to maybe do some more thinking. It's not going to give us the answer. But he thinks as a clue, this question of time. At least he posed it. Now, he couldn't answer it. He too is stuck with this idea that time is three, past, present, and future. I mean, what else can it be? Right now, it's, what time is it for you? It's in the evening, morning time for me. See, I'm telling the time. We know the date. Today is the 21st, April. So all of this is derivative. It comes from something much deeper. And my hypothesis has always been, from the very beginning, that maybe not being purely of Western origins, that why are these guys confusing the question of being without attending to the question of time? Why do they always think of time in terms of three? Why does it get all these definitions? Kant, substance, permanence, it's that which remains in order for change to take place within it. Otherwise, we couldn't even have a representation of two events as successive or simultaneous, coexistent. Einstein's problem, right? The two lightning bolts. Vishal's at the train station waiting. I'm on the moving train. Two lightning bolts hit. He sees it successively or simultaneously. I see the opposite because we have different frames of reference. That's all spatialized thinking. And there are two subjects involved, me and Vishal. That's physics. Good for them. Let them think about that. But we're getting at something much deeper than that. What makes possible the even notion that there are successive and simultaneous events? So to try to bring my talk to a close, because I know we lost a lot of time, speaking of time, if I had to summarize in terms of some theses, the history of Western metaphysics is trying to pose the question of being. There is a relationship between being and time. time is barely either understood or posed as a question until you get to Heidegger, which makes him quite radical. Heidegger struggles. If we had time, we'd go to section 81, which I've been writing on, where he goes to Aristotle, physics. He goes back to Plato, the Timaeus, time as the moving image of eternity. He goes back to Augustine's Confessions, the great Christian thinker of the 3rd century. Time is when it isn't, and it's not when it is. So the paradox. I don't know what it is. This is Augustine, but it must be some kind of extension of my soul. And then he comes back to Kant a little bit and says, I'll come back to him later, which he does. But he ends the book with Hegel. And with Hegel, he doesn't know what to do. He says, oh, Hegel is trapped in this linear time too, this linear flowing time. And it has to overcome, cancel, aufheben, destroy, raise itself to a higher level, consume and conceptualize time as a notion, but then he can't define what that is. And so for Heidegger, this is just the culmination of Western metaphysics. And nobody knows what Hegel's saying anyway. This is Heidegger saying, I'm different from this whole tradition. The problem with Heidegger is that he too doesn't answer his own question. If you look at the end of the book, not is time the horizon for understanding being, but is time the horizon for being. He then leaves all this fundamental ontology. He does many things after this, during this Nazi period, the denazification. As you all know, there's a later Heidegger. There's Heidegger on poetry, on technology, Heidegger on the history of philosophy, other big figures, Heidegger on building, dwelling, thinking. Language, of course, is a dominant question. What is language? Language is the house of being. Many different things he takes on. In 1962, he comes back to a text called On Time and Being. And he tries to come back to this question. But by then, you're so young, right? How old is Heidegger in 1960? He's 70-something. It's too late. I'm sorry. If you're that old, then you can just kind of repeat the basic intuitions that a great philosopher might have, but you may not say anything new. It doesn't work that way. And he says something cryptic in that 62 lecture. He says, true time is four-dimensional. See, he leaves us with this secret. Nobody has picked this up. I'm just telling you, this may be a bold statement, and I know we're recording. I have not seen in the Anglo-American reception of Heidegger, British American, English speaking, since the 1950s to now. The French, that's a more complicated story. There's Derrida, there's Levinas, there's many people that you may have heard of or read. Derrida knows there's something going on, but doesn't articulate it either. And then who's left? The Germans? Well, after 1945, they don't. And then certainly now, because the Nazi issue, the Heidegger is not, there's no big reception of, if anything, they're worried to be overly identified with a figure like Heidegger. There's the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, there's critiques of, Heidegger, and then now, what are called the Black Notebooks. And I know that's a lot for you to get into, but since 2014, his personal notebooks have been published. And once again, those that hate him and think he's anti-Semitic and he's a Nazi, they're trying to look for the proof. And some argue they're finding it. So we're living in a time now, I would argue, if you want to take it back, as Vishal asked me to think about the age or the epoch we're living in. Heidegger says the entire history of Western metaphysics is culminated through Nietzsche, and he's really the last, in this nihilism about individual will and power and the death of religion and no sense of meaning, and it's just technology. Look at the madness of technology now. Some people call it techno-fascism, the oligarchs. You have them in India, we have them here, now controlling government and democracy. It's scary time, climate change. The justification of war, the avowed mutilation of human beings, because no sacred sense of human rights. Here in the West, I do some work on anti-caste movements through different circles, trying to apply these continental philosophers to that. So hierarchical systems that promise democracy, but in fact, there's massive inequality. This is terrible, and it's terrible for you young people who have to imagine living another 50, 60 years. But he, in a way, to give some credit to Heidegger, saw this collapse of the West. But he couldn't see the other beginning. The Greeks began something, and look what it led to. And then he tried to do something, and he couldn't do it. It was too hard. He couldn't finish it. And he also says, in a fascinating way, his 1936 lecture on Schelling at the very beginning, Schelling did something great. Hegel comes and critiques him, and then Schelling just disappears. He's not famous like Hegel becomes the big guy. But he lives a long time and, was doing something different. And it's true, the late Schelling. Nietzsche, he tried to critique and do something different. His eternal return idea for time. But he went mad, as you know. And Heidegger said, don't think of these two figures, Kierkegaard maybe too, as, something bad or negative or a breakdown of two human beings. It's the beginning of something new. Whoever could conquer them or understand what they're doing and go further would have to be the founder of a new beginning. He says things like this other beginning. What is that? The other background of this, now think about it, why this matters to us, and I think we can have our discussion here. The West, meaning Western Europe, and in that, Britain, France, the Dutch, a little bit of the Spanish and Portuguese, in Latin America, the Portuguese for you in India, the colonizers, 1500 slavery, African slavery to the Americas, colonization and slavery, 1500 to the 20th century. And then you might think of, it's a different time now, obviously. The East is rising, India, China, you and China. But it's a post-colonial, neo-colonial structure, for sure. But this idea of the West, the eclipse of the West, we haven't seen this for 500 years. The West, this, that. So what? Here's the East. Here's China. Here's India. Here's the global South. And the shrinking of the West. And inside Europe, the nihilism inside Europe. But I don't want to use that word, but if I say rebirth, resurrection, reincarnation, but the new beginning, the other beginning, requires both for Heidegger and Derrida, a critique of the Western metaphysical tradition, but the opening up of possibilities that are not essential to the West. They may be for Heidegger because he uses that language, but not for Derrida. He doesn't identify with anything. And then there's all of us who come after. So what could my question for us be? I'll put this back to you. You're studying philosophy. You have an interest in Western philosophy and Western metaphysics. I'd like to know what your interests are. And then I can say, well, wait a minute, this is interesting because this points to a future possibility of thinking with, through, and against these Western structures to open up this horizon that Heidegger could never articulate. And one of the questions I want to know from your group is, for those of you that can, I think you all can, read different languages, and I think I asked you this, Vishal, are there translations? I know you read it in English, and I don't know how much of you do German, and of course that means Latin and Greek, and even further if you want to do the biblical Hebrew, but what happens when we translate Being and Time, for example, or Hegel or Kant into Eastern languages? What happens with the fundamental terms? I'm very interested in that. And not because of just translation, but because of the philosophical consequences. Okay, so can I end there, Vishal?
Surely we can end here because it's all right, like how you are putting the question back to us now about our interests in philosophy and in time, and maybe an analog translation of being in time in our languages. I, for one, cannot find anything of my slaves except for whatever I will find in maybe will be very old in the sense of having a old philosophical tradition of its own in Buddhism uh, or other orthodox philosophies in India. So yeah, and any of us, if online, would like to say something to that, so we are open now. So anybody can join. If people here have any ideas to share. But I had questions which I will put up later if nobody has over online.
Sure, please. I will say that you may have expected a different talk. I know we had some problems with the audio, but I have my own lifelong quest as an Indian person of Indian descent who's not Western. What's this one? I don't know what this is. Okay, let me see. Can you hear me? Yeah. So I have my own lifelong quest, and Vishal may know this, but I follow the world of physics very closely to the extent, not mathematically, but the basic concepts, Einsteinian relativity, quantum mechanics, string theory, quantum gravity, Big Bang, debates now about what was there before, there is no beginning, there is another beginning, the singularity of the black hole, the event horizon, the relativity of space-time frameworks, the warping of it, light is constant, reversibility, time travel. It can go on and on and on. That's fun. It's all spatialized, and it gets our minds going great. Not only does it not apply to us human beings, whether we want religion or not. And then speaking of religion, that's not the answer either, because, okay, we die and then we get resurrected or reincarnated. Okay, fine. People can believe that. Good. That doesn't help the philosopher. So we have to do this by ourselves. And what Heidegger was getting at is that there's some strange relationship between what he called the three ecstasies. Not future as tomorrow, but something that's coming. Not past as in my birth I was born in 1971. That's how old I am. You were born in 2000, maybe. I don't know, 2002, 2003. So it's not that past, but I am my having been this. And making present isn't just counting clock time. That's derivative from this primordial. It's the revealing that clears what I should be as a whole stretch of time in life. It sounds very individualistic. But then he says that all three of these things, ecstasies of time, relate to each other in a more primordial ground. And he couldn't articulate that. I've begun my work trying to articulate that ground by using the speculative tools inside Hegel. But I don't buy Heidegger and Derrida telling me, oh, Hegel's just another metaphysician, and he's a simple guy, and he uses three dimensions of time. He believes in the metaphysics of being and presence, and he culminates it. I'm not saying they say it like that, but my point is that they don't think that Hegel is giving us something. I'm appropriating some aspects in him to articulate my own four-dimensional idea of time that has nothing to do with space. It has nothing to do with anything that's present. It's drawing from this Heidegger and Derrida. That's what I wanted to say, but maybe we'll have a different. It's too soon to say that. I have to show you what I'm talking about with that. Okay, sorry. Please.
Yeah, anybody online, if you have anything to say, please go on, Kanye.
We can take it back to why. What are you working on? Yes, please. Who's there?
So since you mentioned, it might not be related to the topic, but since you mentioned about quantum physics, uh, do you see, is there any link between, with the advent of AI, there's a very renewed interest in terms of quantum computing and quantum physics, and they are now trying to reimagine or just rediscover the concept of time and space through how we can just relate it to quantum computing and quantum physics. And there have been many papers in recent times which show that how this surge in quantum computing, or the even the mention of the term is just you can say more of a farce, or more of a thing to just boost up their share prices or something. So, do you think
Listen,
is there any correlation between this renewed interest of quantum computing and the even the concept that we are discussing today, that Western philosophy do like a sort of positioning of time and space? Do you think there's a correlation, or is it just another Silicon Valley thing that is there to just boost the hype machine?
well, I do have a separate presentation on Heidegger's question concerning technology. I'm happy to do that someday. This is a different question. I'm happy to take it. I will say this the AI, the quantum computing, eventually holograms, maybe cloning, biotechnological virtualization, robotics. Imagine having AI being a full-blown human being that you can't distinguish. Everybody's talking about this. You guys are talking about it. The people here, the Western big tech guys are all, everybody's afraid and everyone has something to say. And I think Heidegger would call this the inauthentic or fallen way of trying to think about this, the real consequences of this. So we have to bracket this question of the age. It's very real. I don't think it helps us understand the human question, not because I'm afraid that AI is going to replace humans or even kill us, and it's going to make take over government and then just kill us all. That's how most people talk about it. I'm more concerned about like a Heidegger thinking, okay, well, wait a minute. Before we even raise what is the essence of the human, what's the threat to the human, we have to have some presuppositions about what we're talking about, even when we're put in that, clear to be put in a position to even talk this way and think this way. Something deeper is being concealed. If I go with that, I don't mean to belittle physics, because honestly, you said how do you choose philosophy? I don't know how you, Hegel says he didn't choose philosophy, it chose him. I love math and physics, That's all I grew up with. And my little community of South Indians at the time, they were just obsessed with, he's one of my heroes to this day, Ramanujan. Have you heard, him? The mathematician. He's from the early 20th century. He was a great genius, the man who knew infinity. But Ramanujan is the South Indian chameleon mathematician that went to England, and he's a great figure in mathematics. Anyway, I was obsessed with math, and still in the sense, not math, but the special theory of relativity, for example, is saying, as I mentioned, two different frames of reference can let you observe two different events in two different ways. But there's no way to take a string, for example. If Vishal is sitting at the train station and I'm on the moving train and I see this event successfully, he sees them simultaneously. What am I going to do? Take a string and tie them all together, the four different versions? I mean, my two lightning bolts and his. It becomes a mess. Or particle wave duality. Or non-locality, a singularity in space-time. Or causality at a distance. The whole idea of unifying space-time, 3 dimensions of space, 1 dimension of time. The problem with those guys is when they say time, they just say past, present, or future. That's 1 dimension. Then they attach it to the 3 dimensions. And when that happens, all kinds of strange things can happen. Space-time can get warped, the phenomenon of black holes, what's the Big Bang, Big Crunch, endless expansion. But they're spatializing everything, and they externalize that from the subject. Metaphysicians, I would argue, from Plato and Aristotle, up to Kant, Hegel, and definitely Heidegger, you don't have a subject that's thinking about the outside world, and you don't want to naturalize time as some spatial phenomenon, physical phenomenon. That's what everybody else does. There's a special destiny or gifting, as Heidegger would say. So we have to link this back to the anxiety of the age, to go back to your question, which is, I would say we'd have to think about the temporal horizon. Okay, how do I put this? If Heidegger's right, something happened with the ancient Greeks and techne. For him, anyway, he's obsessed with the West. He only knows the West. And then, that led to the modern technological age, that he's saying, okay, we're not thinking in this age. And then, as you know, there's been an acceleration of computing, 80s, everything bigger gets smaller. down to the laptop, the iPhone, now social media,
So
search
sorry
engine,
to interrupt
Google,
you. So,
and then
sir,
so search engine, then AI. So we're accelerating this technological miniaturization and willing our own extinction, but we still are not thinking about why that's happening. I'll stop there.
yes, sir. Just one last thing that I wanted to add, sir. Why I was asking this because when we see in the present scenario, I think Guardian did a piece on this that when uh, so a lot of the research money or grant money that today is allotted to these institutes, a lot of it is being taken on the projects that are very much related to quantum computing or quantum physics. But the outputs they have mentioned were not in proportion to the funding that these projects were receiving. So they what they did is they cited that back in 1999 or 2005 there was magazines which were telling that world's gonna change because of quantum physics and quantum computing. So around if you see any project that mentions quantum, even somewhere in their introduction or abstracts, they just get the funding pretty fast. But in terms of other projects which might be much more related to fundamental core physics or anything you can say even computing, they tend to lack in terms of receiving funding because they are not mentioning quantum. So I think just over mentioning of this term quantum anywhere, I think it has pretty much reduced the importance of what quantum computing or quantum physics would have achieved
I agree.
and would have
I
done.
agree with you. Yeah, it's unfortunate. All the big companies are just, everyone's hyping it up, the quantum computer. And then, of course, they're Indian companies or Chinese companies, but they're talking about that as even beyond AI. They love to talk about the revolution. You know what, though? This comes back to Heidegger, which is these guys are not thinking about how they're using the idea of time or epochs, accelerating things, the next great thing, revolutionizing things. These are all temporalizations, temporalizing of temporality, as Heidegger says. So I don't think, and they'll say, well, their job is not to think. Their job is to act and create, and who cares what was the past and what's coming. There's no sense of authenticity or responsibility here. As for the quantum computing, actually coming up with different ideas of time, we have to dig deeper into that. But I'm trained, just like you're trying to be trained. If you spend enough time with people like the pre-Socratics, Plato, just read the book for chapter 10 of Aristotle's Physics, a couple of pages, which is what started Heidegger on time. And then you read, if you can do it, I don't know how much you guys are doing, but you kind of have to read Kant and then Hegel. And we haven't even talked about Husserl and phenomenology. But the whole time thing is not, it's not a product of our subjectivity in minds. It's not a matter of external perception. This goes back to Kant. And it's not a physical realm of reality by itself related to change in motion, the physicists, however complicated they can make it. Time dilation, time reversibility, the relativity of aging. A guy at the black hole, he only sees 1 minute. The rest of us on Earth see millions of years, we'll die, millions of years go by. Those are all the paradoxes. We're not talking about that. I don't know how quantum computing affects that. I'm talking about moving this narrow-minded West who gave us the linear historical time, BC AD. They came up with that. Chronological time, the time of colonization. They've always been rooted in three: past, present, future, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. If you go with Christianity, Western Christianity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, they love the three, and Derrida used to speak of the fourth side. Of course, he doesn't mean just go invent a fourth side. We're trying to get at this question. Why this obsession and failure to think time in the West? The West is not pre-colonial. The West is very young. What does the West know about anything? How about other people? What are their interests in? Philosophy in general, or people have specific projects that they're working on?
Anybody online? Or so as you were telling us about I just noted down a few sentences. So, like the critique of metaphysics has to be delayed. I'm more interested in Derrida than Heidegger, basically because I have read him more than Heidegger, and I like him way more better, and find him very accessible. So you mentioned very early in the beginning that critique of the metaphysics has to be delayed. Like that is the idea behind difference. Why did so? Does Derrida believe in no accomplishment at all? That no task, even a critique, no critique is to be completed. If that's a minimal degree, that if that can be acceptable at a minimal degree, that every critique is endless in nature, it is never accomplished. But is it really that simple, or is it in principle impossible to to achieve at a final image of a critique? So that is
Yeah,
one question.
that's a great question. Okay, and the next one? Next question?
Um, so, like all those questions about how change is different from motion and motion from movement, etc. Those are very interesting, but I don't think we have the time or the will to go into that discussion here today because, as you know, we have run out of time. If it ever existed, but in a linear fashion, it exists and very convenient for us. So we might not like to go into that. But one thing I really wanted to ask, because Heidegger has another side of him. Like he definitely talks a lot about being and time, etc. But there are chapters on care in being and time itself. But I think, do you think Heidegger has a thought on embarrassment as such? Like we are embarrassed about a lot of things in our lives, about our insecurities, etc. But Heidegger did not ask the question which was asked by Camus. Like the biggest question for philosophy was, what is the reason that I should not take my own life? I should not kill myself. That is the biggest question for Camus. Did But I realized that suicide is an embarrassing subject to even think about, or maybe personally for me it is, but for others it surely is also. Does that kind of embarrassment has a space of reflection in Heidegger's thought? That is my second question. Yeah.
Two big ones. Let's start with the Derrida, and then we'll try to do something with the Heidegger. And then Vishal, I can go. It's only 9:15 my time. When do we have to end the session? When do you have to end the session?
I think we can end in 15 minutes.
15 minutes. What time is it there?
It's 6:46, so yeah, we're running.
Oh, so you have to go. Running late. You have to go have dinner and do that. Okay, so let's take the Derrida. See, the Derrida, if you read his Usia and Gramé in 1968, a note on a note from Being in Time, and he looks at the very last chapter 6 of Division 2, where Heidegger is going to take again on Aristotle and Plato and Hegel on time, and Derrida is trying to go after Heidegger with his difference, because you were asking. The event of differentiation, don't spatialize that as, the infancy gospels and the Aramaic of Jesus, which has nothing to do with the Christianity that came later, but some funny things like break the wood apart and you'll find me there. It's not the event of differentiation. It's not computational. A doesn't equal B. It's not identity and negation. Hegel, I'm Rajesh because I'm not Vishal. So the negation of Vishal is already built in the positing of my first identity. I have to negate that negation and synthesize it into something different. So it's not any of those registers for Derrida. So you're wondering, okay, well, we can't make that present. The delay would be in both directions of time. So he calls this temporizing spacing. If I were to start with some origin before I differentiate it, that has a series of traces that I'm erasing to make that present, and therefore even stating in time that the event of differentiation took place here or there will make it disappear. You see, it's like a weird thing for him. And then delay I mentioned is not, it's like more of a stretch. The more I try to spatialize time and say I'm losing time, I'm late, I'm doing this, even if I go to clocks and say, oh my gosh, we have to finish in 15 minutes, I didn't finish my point. I'm delaying it. I'm postponing it. I really want to say this, but I can't. That to him is more about the registers of structural linguistics, the signifier and the signified. Every signifier is a word or written or spoken that corresponds to a mental object or an existing thing. The unity is the sign. But the relationship is arbitrary because every signified is itself just to come up with some object to correspond with the signifier. You're just filling it in. Because you're not getting to the meaning of the actual thing. That's being delayed too, even when you come up with an idea. So long story short, if we start with all these registers, there's a beginning, there's an end, there's no beginning, there's no end. He talks about non-origin of the origin, other than the origin. Even when you come up to an end of something. In the 90s, he made fun of this. You guys may not know this, but Fukuyama is a thinker here who talked about the end of history. The Americans beat the Russians. The Cold War is over. That's it. This is the end of history. American capitalism, democracy, liberalism, secularism, financial capital, techno-capitalism. Oh, this is okay. Look, that's it. Try to come up with something else. This is nothing better than this. And then Derrida cleverly looked at this, without saying he's for Marxism or America or capitalism. He just said bringing in an end to history, eschatological ideas, even secular ones like that, versus the Christian eschatology. Or maybe you all know, some of you, the Kuliag. When you spatialize endings like that, you're taking the finite or historicity and endowing it with an eternal conception, like an end, stupidly, and therefore killing off the possibility of history being open. You see? So the end of history is something finite, kills the finitude of history as an opening of possibilities. Because it could be something else. So it's that element of surprise, which is also the arriving and the delay. I'm trying to give you an example how deconstruction be used. I wouldn't say delay. I don't know if we even want to use any of those words. But his main point is that difference is and difference. They sound the same in speech. It's only when you read them that you notice that there's a difference, and hence this idea of writing, as whatever writing is for him is an extension of some archaic trace. He says this in Husserl's Origin of Geometry. The whole idea of sense-making itself, to understand how basic truths of mathematics, for example, geometry, and Husserl, and therefore science and any philosophy that thinks it's a system of truth, you can't just go back to some prior time and say, oh, look how it came about, and tell this great story about that first great thinker. No. It's this weird retroactive thing. We're on this other side of the creation. We want to go back to what was before, but we're always using this side of thinking to understand that before. So when an eternal structure emerges from history, its origin is itself not built into that creation because it came after the fact. So there's that piece. But you mentioned the Heidegger's finitude. You said, how do we keep ourselves? I was trying to understand your question, because even if you take your own life, as in physical death, physician-assisted dying, or suicide, which, by the way, he tried to do after the denazification, and he had to go get some help. That's not the story of Dasein and being in time. Death is a possibility. It's the possibility of impossibility of being in the world, but it's not physically dying, like me taking a gun and killing myself. That's perishing. And that may not help you. Not because you're not going to live beyond that in some afterlife. And not because you could fail, let's say you try to do it and you keep living, but because that too doesn't get to that primordial sense of time. Because that's just another event that you don't live through, of course. As you said, you can transition, but you don't come back and tell us, hey, this is what it's like to die. So there has to be another authentic way to living our life out. But I understand the pressure, because I think in your society, in your generation, in this hyper-technological age, and the superpower India now, you have to do business, and you have to make money, and you have to do technology, or you got to become a politician, I don't know. And same thing here. Nobody wants to. You tell people you're doing philosophy, they look at you like you're crazy. You're young. At least there's a lot of you now. Imagine my time being an Indian, American Nobody was doing what I was doing. I still haven't met any Indian Americans my age who study with Derrida or who's obsessed with Heidegger and philosophy. I meet everybody else doing other things, but it's a tough question. Like, why continue to do this? My only answer to that is it's not determinism, like I have no free will or choice. But it's not a question of killing myself if I had to do something else. Me being anything else is already death. I've become death. To go back to your Bhagavad Gita. So living is already death. And Socrates does this in the Apology. In his trial. So I'm going to die and go hang out with a bunch of other people in the divine space to keep on thinking. In other words, you're born as philosophers. You may not like it, and people, your family may think you're crazy, but you can't stop thinking. And that is the ultimate act of dying to the world and being truly alive, even if everyone else sees it as like a quote-unquote dead end. There are no answers. It's endless, as you said. But what else are you going to do? I don't care about anything else. And I really don't care about being anybody else. Do you see what I'm getting at? So it's beyond free will and determinism. It's like Nietzsche's problem, too. Is this, you will the return of this possibility of choice. That has to be a one-time occurrence. But it's so transcendental that you will its repetition, even though it can only occur once. And that's his strange idea. Meaning your life. It only happens once, but you're living it like there's no other life to live except this one over and over again. Does that say anything, Vishal? I don't know if that helps or makes things worse. Did that get to your question?
That I can see. Can you hear me, sir?
Yes, now I can hear you.
Yeah, so online we have two questions. I'll just read them out. You can do that as well, but let me read it out. What are some other possible conceptions of time that you think is interesting, which don't fall into splitting it into three? So as you mentioned, I think in 62, Heidegger mentioned that it's the four-dimensional time that's the missing part, and you yourself wrote a book on that. But we really don't know what is it all about, and so that's the first question. The second question being that Dasein and there's a German word after that. So something like Befindlichkeit of Heidegger offer existence and being in time, the world, as mutually complementary principles. Okay, so both Buddhist mindfulness and Vedantic Neti allude to cognitive understanding of epiphany of self, considers time as inherent principle in these concepts. Time has no outside or separate meaning here. Please comment from Heidegger's perspective of for existence and such principles. Talks about time inherently embedded. Yeah, that is the question. Second.
Okay, thank you, Vishal. So I don't have enough time to talk about my four-dimensional time, but what I've been doing since my young days with Derrida and Heidegger and doing all that, but being dissatisfied with the Anglo-American reception of continental philosophy, I just decided to do my own thing, and that's why I'm sort of not here nor there, but just traveling the world and trying to find different resources. I know I'm of Eastern ancestry, and I knew I grew up, with this like you, but you're more embedded, of course, in it. And I have a more superficial understanding. So not like a Jewish or Christian tradition in the West. But I became obsessed with Western philosophy at a young age. So I feel like for me, when I go to Plato, Aristotle, Kant, Hegel, Heidegger, less so Schelling, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, but those guys for sure. I always, from the beginning to now, if I had to go on an island by myself, I would take them with me, and then that's enough. But as I mentioned, that early, question, like the special theory of relativity, the motion and rest frames being relative, the perception of events, and then you can talk about the quantum realm, particle wave duality. Is the particle stretched? Does my perception affect it? Why can't I know both the position and the momentum at the same time? I mean, I can, at least in the classical universe, classical world, Newtonian world, I can see things. Oh, there's the car. I can kind of see it right now. It's moving slowly, and I know where it's going. It's not going backwards or up in the air. It's going straight ahead, and I can see it. Well, that doesn't apply to the scale that quantum works at or the cosmological realm. So I have to stay a little aware of what those guys are talking about, because it's pretty interesting, as you said. But the third piece beyond philosophy and science is religion. That, as you mentioned the Buddhist tradition, but I then took to the study of the Christian Gospels, as in not Jesus' death and resurrection, but in the Koine Greek. Actually, if you go back to the Old Testament Hebrew Bible, Moses asks, God, what's your name? And he goes, my name? What do you mean, what's my name? I am who I am. But haya, to be, and is a structure of being, as will be, as it's temporalized. So there's a being and time thing happening there. They can't name their God. They don't idolize it. It's just a name. Yeah, they say Lord, God, Elohim, Adonai. But there's some kind of temporalization going on there that doesn't end up like the Christian structure. And with Christianity and its complexity, you have the fulfilled time of the incarnation, but then you have this end time, this eschatology, the second coming. All kinds of temporal things that even the early Heidegger picked up on. Long story short, there is, before I get to the Buddhism, you can only really iterate past, present, and future 6 different ways. Past, present, future, future, past, present, past, future, present, future. And you can only create relations between them, starting with one aspect, let's say present. You get 6 movements going on in one triangle. Let's say go from past to present, present to past, present to future. So there's 2 movements there. But then there's past to present, past to future. There's 2 movements there. There's future to past and future to present. That's 6. So these 3 and 6, if you just stay with those 3, you can iterate them a billion different times and think about the flow. But Heidegger says that's what Bergson and Husserl try to do. They try to just pick all the possible permutations of all those and try to theorize the movement of it. And in a way, this is what he accuses Hegel of. And he's talking about something else, but he doesn't articulate it. And I begin with the attempt to articulate that 4-dimensionality. It's not about the succession or simultaneous of events. It's not about a beginning or ending or non-beginning or non-ending. Maybe I get to thank my Eastern influence, because the Western guys know nothing about the complex temporality of reincarnation. Not that I do, but I just know that I come from a civilization that posited that. And of course, devout Hindus and Buddhists. Buddhism is a little more difficult. I have to learn more about it now. I can recommend people who do Heidegger and Buddhism to the person that asked the question. Look up a guy called Eric Nelson. He's a Heidegger guy in Hong Kong, but he's doing the Taoism and Buddhism and Heidegger. I will say that Heidegger wants, because of this Western will, the de-self or the non-self. You mentioned mindfulness. I think it's called dependent origination in Buddhist traditions. Death itself as an event for the Buddha. There's a lot to compare. But I guess there's no will to conceptualize metaphysically time, where that desire does exist in these Western thinkers, if that makes sense. Maybe that's not fair. Maybe the Buddhist response is that that's a flawed project. You're missing the deeper sense of enlightenment. Is there another question, Vishal?
No, it's all right. It seems like my friends are running late for their own projects here. So we might want to end the discussion here tentatively.
Sure.
And we would really be happy to have you here if you ever come to New Delhi anytime in the future. So
Oh, I really appreciate the kind invitation. Let me suggest something. If you don't have time to read 100 books by Heidegger or Being in Time, tell the students to do this. 1924, The Concept of Time. It's a brief speech. He didn't even give it to philosophers and academics. He went and spoke to, I don't know, some regular people at some club. 1924. I'll send it to you via email. It's like
sure.
25 pages. If you read that, you don't need to worry about the rest of Heidegger. You'll say, whoa. I'll conclude with this. Because the question is not what is time, but who is time? You see? From there, he's departing from metaphysics. Let philosophers say, oh, what is time? And they're not going to answer it. He asked, who is time? So I'll leave you with that.
True. That's all right. That's a very fine note to end here. So, so we thank you again for joining us. And yeah,
Thank you, Vishal. And if there's ever in the future before India, if people want to really sit down, since you're PhD students, and look at a text like we're trying to do in that reading group, if it's Hegel or Heidegger or Derrida, like even Husserl and Gramé, where Derrida is doing Heidegger and Hegel on time, we can sit down and all look at it together and then try to interpret it together. That might be more beneficial for you than just me talking.
True. That's all right. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. And I hope to see you soon.
Thank you. Same pleasure.
Okay. Bye-bye.